Ruth Calloway didn't pray often, but the night she struck the match and held it over Silas Pruitt's barn, she was praying the whole time. Not for forgiveness, for enough time. Enough time to grab her daughters, get to the wagon, and disappear into the dark before anyone smelled the smoke. She got 12 minutes. 12 minutes to steal her own children back from a man who had bought a judge, buried a will, and decided 2 little girls were his to keep. This is what a mother does when the law fails her. If this story moves you, please subscribe to our channel and follow along until the very end. I want to read every comment, and I want to know what city you're watching from. Let's see how far this story travels. Hit that subscribe button and let's begin. The wagon wheel cracked somewhere outside of Pueblo, and Ruth Calloway didn't stop. She climbed down, assessed the damage the way she'd assessed every crisis in the last 4 years of her marriage. Fast without feeling, because feeling cost time she didn't have, and she looked at her daughter, Nora, sitting straight-backed on the bench with her arms around her brother Sam, and she said, "Hand me the rope from under the seat." Nora didn't ask why. She never asked why when Ruth used that voice. She just reached under and handed the rope down, and Ruth bound the wheel the way a battlefield nurse binds a wound that isn't going to hold but needs to hold long enough. Long enough was all she ever asked for anymore. Sam said, "Mama, are we going to be okay?" "Yes," Ruth said. "How do you know?" "Because I said so." He accepted that. 6 years old, and he accepted it the same way he accepted everything Ruth told him, completely without reservation, with the absolute faith of a child who has learned that his mother does not make promises she doesn't intend to keep. That faith was the most terrifying thing Ruth carried. Heavier than the carpet bag, heavier than the guilt, heavier than the smoke she still imagined she could smell in her hair 3 days out of Laramie. She climbed back up. She took the reins. She did not look back. The road into Millhaven, Colorado territory was the kind of road that told you everything you needed to know about the town at the end of it. Rutted, uneven, patched in places with gravel that had long since scattered. A road maintained by obligation rather than pride. Ruth had driven enough of these roads in the last 6 days to know the difference. She had one name. One single name on a piece of paper that Reverend Aldous Mills of Laramie had pressed into her palm 3 weeks before everything went wrong, back when going wrong was still something she thought she could prevent. Elias Grove, Copper Ridge Ranch, Millhaven, Colorado territory. "He's a good man," Mills had told her. "Kept to himself since the war, since Margaret. But a good man underneath all that keeping." She hadn't asked what happened to Margaret. She'd filed the name away the way she filed everything useful, without sentiment, without plan, just in case. Just in case became 6 days ago when she struck the match. Millhaven came into view the way small towns always did, the church steeple first, then the water tower, then the main road materializing out of the dust like something the land was reluctant to admit existed. Ruth straightened her spine. She always straightened her spine before entering a new place. It was the only armor she had left. "Mama," Nora said quietly, "someone's watching us from the feed store." "I know. There's another one by the post office." "I know, Nora. And a woman in a yellow dress who just went inside when you looked at her." "I know all of it, baby." Ruth kept her eyes forward. "Let them look." The general store was her first stop. It always was. A general store was a town's memory. You could learn everything worth knowing about a place from the man behind the counter, if you asked the right questions in the right order and watched his hands while he answered. The man behind the counter was heavy-set, maybe 65, with the kind of mustache that belonged to a different decade, and eyes that had assessed 1,000 strangers and found most of them wanting. He looked at Ruth. He looked at Nora beside her, 9 years old, and already holding Sam's hand with the protective grip of someone twice her age. He looked at Sam, who was looking at a jar of penny candy with the transparent longing of a child who knows better than to ask. "Help you, ma'am," the storekeeper said. "I'm looking for a man named Elias Grove," Ruth said. "He runs a ranch outside of town, Copper Ridge." The storekeeper's hands stilled on the counter. Just for a moment. Just enough. Who's asking? Ruth Calloway. She didn't offer more. She'd learned that offering more was how you handed people ammunition. Where you coming from? North. She held his gaze. Reverend Mills in Laramie gave me Mr. Grove's name. Said he was a decent man. Said he might be needing help running the place. The storekeeper looked at the children again. He looked at Ruth's carpetbag, the road dust caked into every crease of her dress, the repaired wagon wheel visible through the window. He was doing arithmetic, and she knew what numbers he was adding up. Your husband coming behind you, he said. My husband's dead. He had the decency to look briefly sorry. I see. Ma'am, I don't want to be unkind, but Elias Grove is not what you'd call a welcoming man these days. How many days? Pardon. How many days has he not been welcoming since the war, since his wife, since last Tuesday? She kept her voice even. I'm asking because I'd like to know what I'm walking into. The storekeeper pulled at his mustache. Since Margaret died, going on 3 years now, he keeps the ranch running, keeps to himself. Comes into town when he needs supplies and doesn't stay a minute longer than he has to. He paused. He put it out through Reverend Mills last winter that he was looking for someone to manage the household. Cooking, mending, keeping the books. But that was before, and he'd need to know. He stopped. He'd need to know what Ruth said. He specifically said no children on the property, ma'am. Put it in the letter to Mills himself. Said it plain. The silence in the store was the particular silence of a statement that has landed exactly as hard as it was meant to land. Ruth heard Sam shift beside Nora. She felt Nora's hand find the back of her sleeve. He said that in writing, Ruth said. He did. She stood there with 6 days of running behind her and $3.42 in her pocket, and Warren Pruitt somewhere back along that road, getting angrier by the hour. She stood there and she breathed. Thank you for telling me, she said. You can point me to the road. He pointed her to the road. Outside, Sam tugged her sleeve. Mama, he doesn't want us there. He doesn't know us yet, Ruth said. What if he turns us away? Ruth looked down at her son. 6 years old. Blonde hair that needed cutting eyes that were his father's. That was the hard part. The eyes and a mouth that never stopped moving except around the one subject he absolutely would not touch. She thought about what this child had seen in the last year of his father's illness. What he'd heard the night Warren Pruitt came to the house after the funeral with a document and a smile. Then we figure out what's next, she said. We always figure out what's next. Sam chewed on that. What is next after him? She didn't answer because she didn't have one. She took his hand and Nora's hand, and she walked toward the wagon. Copper Ridge Ranch announced itself first through the fence line, long straight maintained, with an exactness that said something about the man who kept it. Ruth noted the water troughs, the condition of the paddock, the particular absence of waste that characterized a working ranch run by someone who had not given up. Whatever Elias Grove had become, he hadn't given up on the work. That was something. In her experience, a man who still kept his fence line had not completely lost himself. She saw him before he saw them. He was working near the barn, and the first thing Ruth registered was the hands. A rancher's hands should be rough-finished, blunt-knuckled, built for pulling and lifting. His were those things, but the fingers were longer than they should have been, and the way he used them, precise, deliberate, nothing wasted, spoke of a different training underneath the calluses. She filed that away too. He turned when the wagon came within 20 yards. He didn't reach for anything, didn't tense. Just assess the way someone assesses who has learned that most threats announce themselves before they arrive. He looked at Ruth. He looked at the children. Something moved through his face that settled into careful neutrality before she could read it fully. You lost, he said. No, sir. She climbed down from the wagon without waiting for help. Ruth Calloway, Reverend Mills in Laramie gave me your name. I wrote him last month. He said you might still be looking for... I wrote that letter 8 months ago, Elias said. I know it. His eyes went to the children
This
again.
story was posted on the
Nora
channel
had
The
climbed
Rusty
down
Saddle.
and was standing
Please
at
do not
Ruth's shoulder
repost it
with
in
her
any
arms
form.
crossed, watching Elias with the focused evaluation of a child conducting an interview. Sam had stayed on the wagon seat and was also watching, but Sam's watching was different. Quieter, taking inventory of the barn, the horses, the general architecture of escape routes. I also wrote, Elias said slowly, that I didn't want children on this property. I know that too. Ruth held his gaze. The storekeeper in town made sure I understood. Then why are you here? It was a fair question. She'd asked it of herself approximately 200 times over 6 days on the road. She'd given herself 100 different answers, and none of them were the whole truth. And the whole truth was the one thing she hadn't yet decided whether Elias Grove had earned. Because I needed somewhere to be, she said. And your name was the one I had. He took his hat off, ran a hand through his hair, brown going gray at the temples, the gesture of a man buying himself 3 seconds to think. He looked at Nora, who looked back at him with the unnerving steadiness of someone who has decided that flinching is a luxury she can't afford. He looked at Sam, who had finally climbed down from the wagon and was now standing slightly behind Ruth in a way that was half hiding and half positioning close enough to hear everything far enough to seem uninvolved. A child's strategy. Elias Grove noticed it. She saw him notice it. Mills told you I've had a difficult time of it, he said. He said you'd been through something hard. That's a gentle way to put it. He set his hat back on. Ma'am, I'm sorry for your situation. I can see it's considerable, but I'm not in a position to— I'll work for room and board, Ruth said. Nothing else? No wages. I can cook, clean, keep books. I was a nurse before I married. I can tend animals in a pinch. She paused one beat. My children are manageable, one of them more than the other. From behind her, Nora said flatly, She means Sam. I heard that, Sam said. Elias looked at this woman. This road-worn, straight-spined, clearly exhausted woman who had just offered him her entire labor for a roof over her children's heads and spoken without a single tremor in her voice. He looked at the girl who hadn't blinked since he'd turned around. He looked at the boy who was pretending not to listen with the transparent focus of a child who was listening to every syllable. And something happened in him that he hadn't felt in a long time and didn't particularly want to feel now. Not attraction, not sympathy exactly. More like the unsettling sensation of looking at a mirror that shows you something true. He didn't say yes. He said, Come inside. I'll give you water. The kitchen was clean and functional, and had the stripped quality of a room where someone has removed everything unnecessary and not noticed the absence. 1 table. 4 chairs, which struck her immediately. Why 4 chairs in a house with 1 person? A stove that had been worked hard. A window over the sink. And on the far wall, a nail with nothing hanging from it, positioned at exactly the height where a picture frame would sit. Ruth noted the nail. She didn't ask about it. Elias set tin cups on the table and poured water. No ceremony. He stood against the counter and looked at her the way he looked at everything she was beginning to understand directly without deflection, but without aggression. Like a man who has long since stopped seeing the point of pretense. How long were you planning to stay? He said. I don't know yet, Ruth said. Which was the most honest thing she'd said to anyone in 6 days. You running from something? The question landed somewhere specific in her chest. She kept her face even. I'm running toward something, she said. A life that's mine. He looked at her for a long moment. That's a careful answer. It's an honest one. Sam, who had been sitting with rigid politeness for approximately 90 seconds longer than was natural for him, suddenly said, You have a lot of horses. Elias looked at him. I counted 8 in the paddock. Sam continued with the air of someone contributing important information to a negotiation. We had horses at our farm. I know how to fill a water trough. I'm not as good at the heavy stuff yet, but Nora says I will be when I'm bigger. Sam, Ruth said quietly. "I'm just telling him true things," Sam said, which was, Ruth realized with a flash of something painful, exactly what she'd been doing 2 minutes ago. Elias Grove looked at this boy. Something in his face moved complicated, something that cost him, and then he controlled it. She watched the control happen. She recognized it because she did it herself approximately 40 times a day. 8 horses is right, Elias said to Sam. The gray one's Copper. She's the oldest and she knows it. Does she boss the others around? She does. Sam nodded with complete gravity. That's what the oldest one does. Nora beside him said nothing, but she uncrossed her arms. Elias looked at Ruth over the children's heads. There's a room off the back, small, 1 bed. We'll manage, Ruth said. I'm up at 4:30. I'd want breakfast by 5:30 if you're going to be working. I'll have it ready at 5:15. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile. The preliminary territory of a smile, then retreat. I don't want conversation before sunrise. That suits me, Ruth said. I don't want it either. And there it was. The thing she hadn't expected, the particular relief of meeting someone who found silence the same way she did. Not empty. Not absence. Just space to breathe in. I'll show you the room, Elias said. The room was small the way the truth is small, when you've been living in the larger version of a lie for so long. 1 bed, 1 window, a hook on the wall. It smelled like cedar and thyme. Ruth stood in the center of it with Sam pressed against her side, and Nora already examining the window latch with professional interest. It locks, Nora reported. Good, Ruth said. From the inside. That's generally how locks work, yes. Nora looked at her, the look that meant she was asking something she wasn't asking out loud. Ruth gave her a small nod. Yes, we're safe here, for now. Nora accepted it and went back to the latch. Sam looked up at his mother. Mama, he said. He's sad. Mr. Grove. Yeah. Sam's voice was matter of fact. He's the kind of sad where he doesn't want to talk about it. Ruth looked at her son, 6 years old. She pressed her hand to the top of his head, and he leaned into it, and she thought about Warren Pruitt on the road back in Laramie with a piece of paper and a judge's name, and the absolute conviction of a man who had decided that 2 children were his to control. She thought about what she'd done before she'd left, what she hadn't told anyone, what she would have to decide eventually whether to tell the man in the kitchen. Not yet, she thought. Not until I know he'll hear it. She told herself that was wisdom. She'd been telling herself that every mile of every day since Laramie. She was up before 4:30. The stove was a learning curve, every stove was, but she'd mastered harder things in less time under worse conditions. By the time the sky went from black to the particular gray-blue that meant sunrise was 20 minutes out, she had coffee-made biscuits in and salt pork crisping in the pan. Elias came in at 5 minutes past 5. He stopped in the doorway. He looked at the table, the food, the coffee, and then at Ruth's back where she stood at the stove. He didn't say anything. Neither did she. He poured himself a cup, sat down, and when she set the plate in front of him, 2 minutes later, he ate without comment and without ceremony. And it was the most comfortable silence Ruth Calloway had been inside since before she understood what her marriage was and wasn't going to be. She didn't analyze that. She just noted it, the way she noted the nail on the wall, and the 4 chairs, and the window that faced east, as if whoever built this house wanted the sunrise to have nowhere to hide. Sam appeared at 5:45, hair disordered, still half asleep, and immediately looked at Elias with the directness of a child who hasn't yet learned the social economy of working up to things. Did you decide? Sam said. Elias looked up from his plate. Decide what? Whether we're staying. He sat down, looked at the biscuits, looked at Elias. Nora says you haven't decided yet. Sam, Ruth said from the stove. It's a fair question, Sam said. Elias set his fork down. He looked at this boy, this blonde, blue-eyed, relentlessly verbal boy.
This
who
story was
attacked a
posted on the
question
channel
same
The
way he
Rusty
apparently
Saddle.
attacked
Please do
everything
not
directly
repost it in
and
any
without
form.
strategy. Something about the directness was disarming in a way that made it worse, not better. "No," Elias said. "I haven't decided." Sam nodded as if this were acceptable. He took a biscuit. "You should let us stay," he said conversationally, pulling it apart. "Mama works harder than anyone I've ever seen. And Nora's real quiet when she decides to be, which is most of the time. And I can help with the horses. I already told you I know about water troughs." "Sam." Ruth's voice was quiet. "I'm just telling him true things, Mama." Elias looked at this child, this completely undaunted child, who had assessed the situation and decided the best approach was the honest one, and something behind his eyes shifted. Ruth, watching from the stove, saw it happen. A small thing, but she'd learned to read small things. Small things were where the truth lived. "You really know about water troughs," Elias said. "Yes, sir. You have to clear the moss from the edges every 3 days or the horses won't drink from the far end. They know. Horses always know." Elias looked at him for one more second, then he picked up his fork. "Almost right," he said. "Every 4 days, but close enough." Sam beamed. He ate his biscuit. He didn't press further because some negotiations even a 6-year-old could sense were better left at a win. Ruth turned back to the stove and breathed. It was on the second morning that Nora found the photograph. She wasn't snooping. Ruth would have been clear on that point if anyone had asked. Nora was dusting the shelf above the fireplace, the way Ruth had asked her to, and the small tin box tilted when she lifted it, and the lid wasn't fully latched, and the photograph slid out and fell face up on the floor. A woman, young, dark-haired, laughing. Not posing, laughing at something off to the left of the frame, something the camera couldn't catch. The kind of laugh that made the whole photograph feel like an interruption, like you'd walked in on a private moment and the woman in the picture hadn't noticed yet. Nora picked it up. She stood with it in her hands for a long moment. Then she put it back in the box, closed the lid, and put it exactly where she'd found it. She found Ruth in the kitchen and said very quietly, "There's a photograph in the tin box over the fireplace." "I know," Ruth said. She'd seen it the first day. "It's a woman. She's laughing." "I know." Nora was quiet for a moment. "Who hung the nail?" Ruth looked at her daughter. "What?" "There's a nail on the wall," Nora said, "and nothing on it. Someone put it there for that picture, and then they took the picture down and put it in the box." She looked at her mother steadily. "That's a person deciding something." Ruth had no answer for that, so she said, "Set the table. He'll be in soon." That evening, after the children were in the back room, Ruth sat at the kitchen table alone and looked at the nail and thought about Elias Grove moving through this house for 3 years with that photograph in a box and that nail on the wall and the 4 chairs at the table when only one was needed. She thought about Warren Pruitt, who would be making inquiries by now, who would be writing letters, who had a document signed by a judge in Laramie County that said 2 children named Nora and Samuel Calloway were wards of the Pruitt family estate pending resolution of their father's debts. She thought about what she'd done the night before she'd taken the wagon. She'd told herself she'd explain it when the time was right. She'd been telling herself that since mile 1. She was going to have to stop telling herself that eventually. She knew it the same way she knew which wounds were going to close on their own and which ones weren't. She'd learned that in the war. Some things didn't heal without intervention. Leaving them alone just meant the infection went deeper, spread further until the thing that could have been treated early became the thing that couldn't be treated at all. But not yet. Not tonight. She got up. She dried her hands on her apron. She went to the back room and checked on her children. Sam asleep with his mouth open, Nora asleep with her hands folded on her chest, like a woman twice her age, and she thought one more day. One more day to make herself necessary. She was very good at making herself necessary. It was the only leverage she'd ever reliably had. Outside, she heard the porch boards creak. Elias not going to bed yet. Standing out there the way men stood in doorways when they were carrying something they hadn't put down yet. She didn't go out. She went back to bed. She lay on her side of the narrow mattress in the dark and looked at the ceiling and listened to her children breathe. And she thought about the name on the piece of paper that a reverend had pressed into her hand. Elias Grove, Copper Ridge Ranch. She'd come here because it was the only name she had. She was beginning to understand it might have been the right one. That scared her more than Warren Pruitt, more than the document, more than the smoke she imagined she still smelled in her hair. Hope was always the most dangerous thing to carry. She'd learned that. You could set down fear, set down grief, set down anger. But hope weighed nothing until suddenly it weighed everything, and by then you were already depending on it. She breathed. She let the fear sit there beside the hope. Outside the porch, boards creaked again, and then quiet. And then the particular silence of a Colorado night that had no opinion about any of it, and never would. The second week was harder than the first, and not for any of the reasons Ruth had prepared herself for. She'd prepared for hostility, for cold silences that meant something different from the comfortable ones, for the particular brand of resentment that came from a man who'd been cornered into a situation he hadn't chosen. She'd lived with that kind of silence for 4 years, and she knew its texture, knew the way it sat in a room like weather. What she hadn't prepared for was Elias Grove being quietly, consistently, almost aggressively decent. He didn't announce it. That was the thing. A man who wanted credit for his decency found ways to make you notice it. Elias did things the way he did everything, without performance, without acknowledgement, without any apparent need for the gesture to be seen. The second morning, the back door latch that had been stiff was suddenly not stiff. She hadn't mentioned it. He hadn't mentioned it. It was simply different. On the fourth day, she came in from hanging washing to find that the three-legged stool in the kitchen corner had a fourth leg. She looked at it for a long moment, and then she went back to what she was doing, because there was nothing to say about a thing that hadn't been discussed. Sam noticed everything. Sam always noticed everything, and then reported on it with the relentless transparency of a child who hadn't yet learned that some observations were better kept internal. He fixed the stool, Sam announced at supper on the fourth evening, looking directly at Elias. "Sam," Ruth said. "I'm just saying he fixed it." Elias looked at his plate. "It needed fixing." "You didn't say anything about it, though." "Didn't need saying." Sam considered this with genuine philosophical interest. "Nora says some people do things without needing to be thanked for them." He tilted his head. "Are you one of those people?" Elias looked up at him. Something in his face was doing that thing Ruth had been cataloging. The almost thing, the preliminary motion toward an expression that didn't quite complete itself. "I reckon so," he said. "Mostly." Sam nodded slowly. "My papa wasn't like that," he said in exactly the tone of someone making a neutral observation about the weather, no weight in it, no grief, just fact. "He needed to be thanked. A lot. Mama always said it was how he was raised." The table went absolutely still. Ruth set her fork down with the controlled gentleness of a woman diffusing something. "Sam," she said. Her voice was careful. "I'm just telling true things." Sam said, which was becoming, she realized, his entire philosophy of human interaction. Elias was quiet for a moment. He looked at Ruth across the table, not with pity, she would have closed off immediately against pity, but with something that was more like recognition. The look of one person who has packed things down very tightly for a long time, seeing another person doing the same. "Your mama cooked this," he said to Sam, which was not a response to what Sam had said, and was exactly the right thing to say. "That's something worth saying thank you for." Sam looked at his plate, back at Elias. "Thank you, Mama," he said obediently. And then, because he was Sam, "She's a really good cook. Even when we didn't have much, she made it taste like a lot. Back in Laramie before." He stopped. His mouth closed. And for just a moment, the brightness went out of his face the way a lamp goes out when the oil runs low. Ruth watched her son remember himself.
This story was posted on the
watched him
channel The
choose
Rusty
consciously
Saddle.
and
Please
with
do not
visible effort
repost it in
not
any
to go
form.
where he'd been about to go. Watched him pick his fork back up and put a piece of salt pork in his mouth and chew and look at the window. Nora, without looking up from her plate, reached over and put her hand over Sam's wrist. Just for a second. Just long enough. Elias saw it. Ruth saw him see it. Neither of them spoke. It was Nora who broke the careful distance first, and she did it the way she did everything indirectly with strategy, in a manner that could be attributed to something other than what it actually was. She started asking Elias questions about medicine. Not personal questions, not the kind that required him to offer anything of himself. She asked about wound care, about the properties of different herbs, about why a fever broke when it broke, and what it meant when it didn't. She asked the way she read books systematically from the foundation up, as if she were constructing something, and needed every piece in its correct position before she could move to the next one. The first time it happened, 3 days into the second week, Elias stopped in the middle of the kitchen, on his way to the back door, and looked at her with the expression of a man who has just been asked an unexpected question in a language he thought he'd forgotten. "Where'd you learn about poultices?" he said. "I read," Nora said. "We had a medical book. Mama used it sometimes." She looked at him with those gray level eyes that missed nothing. "You know about medicine, don't you? More than a regular rancher." Elias was quiet for a moment. "What makes you say that?" "The way you looked at Sam's hand when he cut it on the fence yesterday. You saw the cut before he told you it was there, and you looked at it the same way Mama looks at things, like you're already deciding what to do." Ruth at the stove said nothing. She kept her back to them and her ears open. "I was a surgeon," Elias said, "during the war." "Which side? Union?" Nora processed this. "Why'd you stop?" The question sat in the kitchen air for a long moment. Ruth could hear Elias decide how much to answer. "Some things," he said finally, "you can do for a long time, and then one day you find out you can't anymore." Nora looked at him. "Because of the war?" "Partly." "Because of your wife?" Ruth turned around. She couldn't stop herself. "Nora," she said, with the particular quiet that was not quietness at all. "It's all right," Elias said. He was looking at Nora steadily. "Yes," he said. "Both." Nora nodded once, filing it. "I'm sorry," she said, and she said it the way she said things that she meant, without performance, without the social decoration that made sorry easier to hear, but less true. She meant it, and she said it plain, and then she went back to her book. Elias stood in the kitchen for 3 more seconds than he needed to. Then he went out the back door. Ruth looked at her daughter. Nora did not look up from her book, but the corner of her mouth moved just slightly, and Ruth understood that her 9-year-old had just done something entirely deliberate, and had done it well. The trouble with Elias Grove, Ruth was learning, was that he noticed things too. She'd thought his quietness was inattentiveness, the way quiet sometimes was. People who went silent because they'd stopped watching. But his quiet was the other kind. The kind that watched harder because it wasn't spending energy on talking. He noticed that Sam didn't talk about their father. He noticed that Nora slept with the window cracked, no matter the temperature, the specific habit of a child who needed the sound of outside to feel safe inside. He noticed that Ruth checked the door locks twice every night before bed, and that she always knew where her children were in a room, even when she appeared to be focused on something else entirely. He didn't say anything about any of it, but she caught him noticing, and she knew he caught her catching him, and they existed for several days in this careful mutual awareness that neither of them acknowledged out loud. It was Sam who made him say something. Sam had a gift for getting to the thing people were circling around simply by walking directly into the center of it. It happened on a Thursday. Elias was working in the barn, and Sam had followed him out, not obviously, not with announced intention, just gradually appearing the way children appeared in places they'd decided they had a right to be. He'd been quiet for almost 10 minutes which for Sam was a geological era. He was watching Elias work with the focused attention of a boy who is building up to something. "Mr. Grove," he said. "Sam. Can I ask you something? You're going to whether I say yes or not." Sam considered this fair. "Do you think people can get unsad?" Elias's hands stilled. He looked at the boy. "What kind of question is that?" "A real one," Sam said. "I'm asking a real one." Elias was quiet for a moment. He set down what he was holding and turned to look at Sam fully, the way Ruth had noticed he did, with things that deserved his full attention. "I think," he said slowly, "that some kinds of sad don't go away. They just get smaller, or you get bigger around them." Sam thought about this with visible effort. "Which one are you?" "Still working on it." Sam nodded. "Me too," he said so quietly and so completely without self-pity that Elias Grove Ruth's instinct told her later when Sam reported the conversation in full at supper had probably needed a moment before he could respond. "You're 6 years old," Elias had said. "I know," Sam had said. "Mama says sad doesn't check your age first." The next morning Elias left a wooden horse on the kitchen table, rough cut shaped from a block of pine, not refined, but immediately and unmistakably a horse. No note. No explanation. It was simply there when Sam came down for breakfast. Sam picked it up. He held it in both hands for a long moment, turning it over. He looked at Elias, who was drinking his coffee and looking at the window with the elaborate casualness of a man who has placed something on a table and is now pretending he has no opinion about whether anyone has noticed. "Did you make this?" Sam said. "The pine needed using up," Elias said. Sam looked at the horse. He made it walk across the table step by careful step. "His name is Copper," he announced. "After the mare." "She'll be flattered," Elias said, still looking at the window. Sam smiled. It was the first time Ruth had seen him smile without an effort behind it, not the bright performed smile he used when he was working hard at being fine, but the real one, the unguarded one that reached all the way up to his eyes and stayed there. Ruth turned back to the stove before anyone could see her face. She was telling herself everything was manageable, right up until the morning Agnes Whitmore's buggy came up the ranch road. Ruth heard it before she saw it. She was at the kitchen window, and she heard hoofbeats at the wrong time of day, mid-morning. Not a supply run, not Elias coming in, and the particular rhythm of someone driving with purpose rather than direction. She was at the door before the buggy cleared the fence line. The woman who climbed down was maybe 60, broad-shouldered, with the kind of face that had formed its opinions decades ago, and saw no reason to revisit them. She wore a good dress and a better hat, and she looked at Ruth the way Ruth had been looked at in every town she'd passed through as a problem that hadn't been categorized yet. Elias came out from the barn. "Agnes," he said. His voice was neutral in the specific way it was neutral when he was managing something. "Elias." Agnes Whitmore looked at him, then back at Ruth, then at the children in the doorway behind Ruth. "I heard you had people staying out here. I wanted to see for myself." "Word travels fast in Millhaven," Elias said. "Word travels at the speed it needs to." She looked at Ruth. "Mrs. Calloway is it I run the boarding house in town. I know most everyone who comes through." She paused, and what she did with that pause was deliberate. "I had an interesting visitor 2 days ago, a man, well-dressed. Came in on a good horse and asked for a room and asked a lot of questions about the properties in the area." She looked at Ruth with an expression that wasn't unkind, and wasn't kind either, the expression of a woman delivering information she has decided you need to have regardless of whether you want it. He asked specifically about Copper Ridge. Ruth's hands at her sides stayed still. She had practiced that. What did he look like? Tall, sandy hair. Had a way of smiling that didn't reach his eyes. Agnes tilted her head. Gave his name as Pruitt. Said he was the children's family. Said he'd been looking for quite a while. The word landed the way it always did. Family. Warren Pruitt had been using that word since the funeral, and he would use it until someone made him stop Because it was the most efficient word. He had it made him sound reasonable, made Ruth sound like the obstacle, and it was technically true in the narrowest possible definition of the term.
This story was posted on the channel
did
The
you tell
Rusty
him?
Saddle. Please
Elias
do not
said.
repost it
His
in
voice
any
had
form.
changed register, not loud, not sharp, but something in it had gone very still. I told him I couldn't speak to where any particular family might be residing, Agnes said. And then I told him my rooms were full. She looked at Elias with the expression of a woman who has made a decision and is informing you of it rather than asking your opinion. They weren't full. I just didn't like his eyes. Ruth breathed. One full breath measured. Where is he now? Elias said. Rode out yesterday, toward Pueblo. Agnes paused. Doesn't mean he won't come back from another direction. She looked at Ruth, and something shifted in her face. Not warmth exactly, but the thing that happened just before warmth, the preliminary softening. You've got children, she said. I don't know your situation, and I won't pretend to. But I know Warren Pruitt's type, and I know Elias Grove, and that tells me enough about which side of this I'm standing on. She put her hat back on. I'll be going. Elias, you need anything from town, you send word. She climbed back into the buggy and drove back down the road without waiting for a response, which Ruth suspected was how Agnes Whitmore handled most situations. Elias turned around. Ruth was still standing in the doorway. Her face hadn't moved, but her knuckles where her hand gripped the doorframe were white. Ruth, he said. It's Warren Pruitt, she said. Her voice came out scraped down the way voices came out when you'd been holding too much for too long, and something had just pressed on exactly the wrong place. My husband's cousin. He came to the house 3 weeks after Thomas died. Came with a document. She stopped. He has a judge in Laramie. Says the children are Pruitt family wards by right of Thomas's debts. Says I abandoned stable residence when I left. Elias walked toward her. Not fast. The way he moved when he was giving her space to decide whether she wanted him closer. He stopped a few feet away and looked at her with those steady brown eyes. How long have you known he was coming? He said. She held his gaze. She was done looking away from questions she deserved to be asked. Since the first mile out of Laramie. The silence after that had weight. She could feel him absorbing it, adjusting. Not to something worse, she could see him make the distinction, adjusting to more complete information rather than betrayal. You knew, he said, not accusation, just the careful quiet of a man who needs to say the true thing out loud before he can move past it. I knew he'd come looking. I didn't know how fast. She looked at him straight. I was going to tell you when I was sure you wouldn't send us back out on that road. He was quiet for a long moment. His jaw worked once. What does he want, truly? She thought about Thomas's land, about the letter she'd found in the bureau 6 months before Thomas died, the one with Warren's handwriting and numbers that didn't add up to anything Thomas had agreed to. She thought about the document Warren had produced at the funeral, signed and witnessed, transferring guardianship of Nora and Samuel Calloway in the event of Thomas Calloway's death. She thought about the mine survey she'd seen folded inside that document. Copper Ridge wasn't the only place in this territory with copper in the ground. The children, she said, and what they stand to inherit. Elias looked at her for a long time. Something was happening in his face that she'd learned to wait for the working through, the settling the arrival at a position. He was not a man who reacted before he understood. She had come in 11 days to depend on that. You should have told me from the beginning, he said. I know that. I had a right to know what I was walking into. You did. She held his gaze and didn't move around the words. But I didn't know you. And I had 2 children and 1 name on a piece of paper, and I made the decision I could make with what I had. She stopped. I'm telling you now. Because Agnes Whitmore forced it. Because Agnes Whitmore forced it, she agreed. And because you fixed the stool and the door latch and carved a horse for my son out of scrap pine, and I have spent 11 days watching you be a decent man when you had no reason to be, and you deserve the truth." The quiet that followed was different from the quiet before. It wasn't the absence of something. It was the presence of something that hadn't been in the room 11 days ago. Elias looked at her for one more long moment. Then he said, "I'm going into town tomorrow. I want to talk to Deputy Harmon before Pruitt comes back." She blinked. "Why?" "Because a man who comes asking questions at a boarding house and then rides out is a man who is making a plan," Elias said. "And I'd rather Cole Harmon knows what kind of plan before it arrives at my gate." He paused. "This is my property. Whatever comes onto it concerns me." She stood there in the doorway and felt something shift in her chest that she hadn't been ready to feel. Not relief exactly, more like the specific sensation of a burden that has been redistributed, still present, still real, but no longer carried entirely by one pair of hands. She wasn't ready for that either. She hadn't been ready for most of what had happened in 11 days on a Colorado ranch with a man who fixed things without announcing it and carved horses from scrap pine and looked at her children like they were worth seeing. "Elias," she said. He stopped. "Why?" she said. "You didn't ask for any of this." He stood with his back half turned, the late afternoon light catching the gray at his temples, and he was quiet long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said without turning around in a voice that came from somewhere that had nothing to do with logic or practicality or any of the sensible reasons a person might give, "No, I didn't ask for it." He went back toward the barn. Ruth stood in the doorway and watched him go. Behind her, she could hear Sam making his wooden horse walk across the kitchen table step by step, narrating something under his breath. She could hear Nora turn a page. She thought about Warren Pruitt riding toward Pueblo with a plan taking shape. She thought about the document she hadn't told Elias about yet. The other document. The one that wasn't about guardianship. The one she'd found in the survey pouch when she was looking for something else and had understood in one cold, clarifying moment exactly what Warren had been doing for the 3 years before Thomas died. She was going to have to tell him. She knew it the way she knew wounds. You could leave it. Or you could deal with it before it went deeper. Not tonight, but soon. Because some things didn't wait for the right moment. They just waited until you were ready enough, and ready enough would have to do. Deputy Cole Harmon was 28 years old and had the particular loyalty of a young man who owed someone his life and had never found a way to repay it. Elias had pulled a Confederate bayonet out of his side at Chickamauga and kept him breathing through a fever that took 3 men in the same tent, and Cole Harmon had spent 6 years since then looking for ways to be useful to a man who never asked for anything. He listened to everything Elias told him in the sheriff's office on Friday morning, with his arms crossed and his face getting progressively tighter. When Elias finished, Cole was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Warren Pruitt, I know that name." "How?" "He came through here about 8 months back, before Mrs. Calloway arrived. Asked a lot of questions about land surveys in the county, about mining assessments." Cole looked at him. "I thought he was a speculator. We get them through here sometimes, men looking for the next copper strike." He paused. "He asked about Copper Ridge specifically." Elias went still. "He asked about my land. He asked who owned it, whether there'd been any recent survey work done, whether you had heirs." Cole met his eyes. "I told him the property was private, and he could speak to the land office if he had legitimate business." He uncrossed his arms. "He didn't go to the land office. He just rode out." They looked at each other across the desk, with the wordless communication of 2 men who have just watched the same pieces fall into a shape neither of them wanted to see. "It's not just the children," Elias said. "Doesn't look like it." Elias thought about Ruth standing in the doorway with her knuckles white on the doorframe. He thought about what she'd said the children, and what they stand to inherit. He thought about the way she'd said it. Like a woman who knew more than she'd said and had decided what order to say it in. I need to know everything you know about Pruitt, Elias said. Cole told him. It wasn't much a name, a description, a pattern of behavior that looked like research, but it was enough to confirm that Warren Pruitt had been interested in Copper Ridge before Ruth Calloway ever set foot in Millhaven. Which meant whatever he was after the children were the mechanism, not the motive. Elias rode home with that sitting in his chest like a stone. Ruth was at the stove when he came in. She heard the particular cadence of his boots on the kitchen floor, and she turned around before he spoke, because she'd learned his silences by now, and this one was different. Tell me about the survey, he said. She set the spoon down. What survey? The one Warren Pruitt was asking about 8 months ago, before you arrived. He looked at her steadily. Cole Harmon told me. Pruitt came through
This
Millhaven
story was
in December
posted on the
asking
channel
about
The
Copper
Rusty
Ridge,
Saddle.
about
Please
who
do
owned
not
it,
repost
about
it in
mining
any form.
assessments. He paused. You said the children and what they stand to inherit. I need to know what that means exactly. Ruth was quiet for a long moment. The kind of quiet that wasn't absence, it was calculation. He could see her deciding. He recognized it because he did it himself, that rapid internal accounting of what a person could afford to give and what they needed to keep back. There's a document, she said. Not the guardianship claim. Another one. She looked at him. I found it in Thomas's survey pouch 3 months before he died. It was a land assessment for the Calloway property in Laramie County. She stopped. And for 2 other properties. Adjacent parcels. One of them is registered to a holding company out of Denver. She held his gaze. The holding company's registered agent is Warren Pruitt. Elias did not move. He surveyed land adjacent to your husband's property and filed a claim on it before Thomas died. Ruth's voice was even, but underneath the evenness was the controlled burn of a woman who has been angry for a very long time, in a situation where anger was not a luxury she could afford. The Calloway property has a copper vein running through the northeast corner. Thomas knew about it. He never had the capital to work it. She stopped. Warren did. And if he controls the children, Elias said slowly, working it through out loud the way he worked everything through, he controls their inheritance of the property, which gives him legal access to the northeast corner without ever having to buy it outright. Ruth looked at him. He has been planning this since before Thomas's first bad winter, maybe longer. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, Sam was somewhere near the barn, his voice carrying in the particular one-sided way of a child conducting a conversation with an animal that was not responding verbally. Nora was in the back room. The ordinary sounds of an ordinary afternoon in a situation that was not ordinary at all. You knew this, Elias said. When you came here, you knew all of this. Yes. And you told me about the guardianship claim. You didn't tell me about the survey, about the land, about what he's actually after. Ruth met his eyes. She didn't look away. She owed him that much. No, I didn't. Why? Because the guardianship claim was something you could understand quickly. A man who wants children who hit a child who filed a legal claim to control a widow's family. She said it plain, no softening. The land scheme is more complicated. It takes longer to explain, and I wasn't... She stopped. Started again. I wasn't sure how much you wanted to know. I wasn't sure how much was your problem to carry. Elias looked at her for a long moment. His jaw was set, but his eyes were doing the thing she'd come to recognize, the working through the fair-minded sorting that happened before he arrived at a position. You should have told me, he said. All of it. From the beginning. I know that. I've been walking into town to talk to Cole Harmon with half the picture. I know that too. She held his gaze. You're angry. I'm not angry. He said it in a way that was more honest than a denial. I'm trying to be fair to a woman who was making decisions under fear with 2 children and no good options. He paused. But I need you to understand something, Ruth. I can't protect what I can't see. And you've been keeping half of this in the dark. The word protect landed somewhere in her chest with a force she hadn't expected. She'd been protected before, or someone had called it that. Thomas, in the early years before the illness, changed the shape of everything. Protection had looked like being told what to do, what to think, where to go, and when. She'd confused it with love for long enough that untangling the two had taken years she hadn't had. This was different. She could feel that it was different, and that frightened her more than if it had been the same. "I'm telling you now," she said. "All of it. All of it." He looked at her for another moment. Then he pulled out a chair and sat down. "Then sit down," he said, "and tell me everything about that survey document. Every detail you remember." She sat. She told him. All of it this time, the document, the dates, the holding company name, the specific coordinates of the land assessment. She'd memorized it the way she memorized everything important, because paper could be lost or taken, and memory was the only storage that traveled with you. She watched him listen with the focused precision of a man who had spent years making fast decisions with incomplete information, and had learned that every detail mattered. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "The document," he said. "Do you still have it?" "No, I made a copy. The original is—" She stopped. "Ruth. The original is in Warren Pruitt's bureau drawer in Laramie," she said carefully, "because I put it back before I left." He looked at her. "You had it, you copied it, and you put it back. If it disappeared, he'd know I'd seen it. If it stayed where he'd left it, he'd have no reason to think I knew what it contained." She met his eyes. "I needed him to believe I was running blind." Elias Grove sat across the table from her and looked at her with an expression that was so far from what she'd expected. Not anger, not betrayal. Something that was almost the opposite, that she didn't have a category for it immediately. Then she recognized it. It was the expression of a man looking at someone who is considerably more capable than he had understood, and recalibrating accordingly. "You planned this," he said. "Not an accusation. An adjustment." "I planned the parts I could plan," Ruth said. "The rest, I survived." He was quiet for a moment. "The copy you made, where is it?" She reached into her apron pocket and put a folded piece of paper on the table between them. She'd been carrying it since Laramie. She'd slept with it folded under her side of the mattress since she arrived at Copper Ridge. He looked at it. He reached out and unfolded it. He read it the way he read everything, completely without rushing. When he looked up, something had settled in his face. Not resolution. The particular quality of a man who now sees the full scope of the problem and is deciding where to begin. "Garrett," he said. "Thomas Garrett. He practices out of Denver. He handled the territorial land dispute for the Morrison family 2 years back. He's good, and he doesn't have any connection to Laramie County." He folded the paper back up. "I'm going to write to him today." Ruth stared at him. "You're going to hire a lawyer." "We're going to need one." He looked at her. "Cole Harmon is a fair man, and he's on our side, but Pruitt's going to come back with more than questions. He's going to come back with paper. We need to be ready with our own." The word "our" sat in the middle of the table between them. Neither of them acknowledged it directly, but it was there. "Elias," Ruth said, "this is not your problem. Warren Pruitt, the land claim, the guardianship document, none of this belongs to you." "It's on my property," he said simply. "That's not a reason." "Then consider it a reason I haven't gotten to yet." He stood up. "I'm going to write that letter. You should get some rest. You look like you haven't slept properly since Laramie." "I haven't," she said, before she could stop herself. He looked at her. Just for a moment. Something moved in his face. Not the controlled expression, not the careful neutrality, but underneath it, the thing that lived underneath it. Then he went to the desk. She sat at the table and listened to him write and thought that she was in serious danger of making a mistake she hadn't made in a very long time. The mistake of trusting someone who hadn't earned it yet, except he had, and that was the problem. Warren Pruitt arrived on a Wednesday. He came in the late morning with a man Ruth didn't recognize riding beside him, not his Laramie lawyer, someone local, someone who'd been retained in the territory. That told her everything. He'd done his homework. He always did his homework. Ruth saw the horses from the kitchen window and she said, "Nora, take Sam to the back room.
This
Close
story
the
was
door."
posted on the channel The
Nora
Rusty
looked up
Saddle.
from her book.
Please do not
She saw
repost it
Ruth's
in any
face.
form.
She stood. "Sam," she said, "come on." "Where are we going?" Sam said. "Back room." Nora took his hand. "But I was going to—" "Sam." Her voice had Ruth's voice in it. That particular quiet that was not a request. Sam went. The door closed. Ruth straightened her spine and walked out onto the porch. Elias was already in the yard. He'd come from the barn, and he was standing with his arms loose at his sides and his hat on, and his face in the expression she recognized as the one he used for situations that required him to be entirely still while moving very fast inside. Warren Pruitt climbed down from his horse. He was tall, sandy-haired, impeccably dressed for a man who'd ridden from Pueblo, and he smiled the way he always smiled, warmly, easily, like a man who had decided in advance that this was going to go his way. "Mrs. Calloway," he said, looking past Elias to Ruth on the porch. "I have been looking for you for quite a while." "I know," Ruth said. He looked at Elias. "Elias Grove, I take it. I've heard a lot about you." He extended his hand. "Warren Pruitt. I'm family to Mrs. Calloway's children." Elias looked at the hand. He shook it because a man who didn't shake hands was a man who had already decided on conflict, and Elias Grove was not a man who decided on conflict before he had to. "Mr. Pruitt," he said. "What can I do for you?" "I'm here about the children," Warren said pleasantly. "Nora and Samuel. Their father was my cousin. We're close family." He reached into his jacket. "I have a legal document from Judge Harker in Laramie County establishing guardianship in the event of—" "Judge Harker doesn't have jurisdiction in Colorado territory," Elias said. Warren's hand paused inside his jacket. Just for a moment. "Guardianship established in one territory is generally recognized. Generally isn't the same as legally," Elias said. "And I'd suggest before you pull that paper out, you consider the conversation you're about to have, rather than the one you planned." Warren looked at him. The calculation Ruth had watched him perform on every man he'd encountered was happening now, the rapid assessment of what he was dealing with. She watched him categorize Elias as a rancher, a physical man, someone to be managed through the appearance of reasonableness. He made the paper disappear back into his jacket. He smiled. "Mr. Grove, I understand you've been kind to Ruth and the children. That's admirable. But these are Pruitt family children, and family has—" "Those children's names are Calloway," Elias said. "And their mother is standing on my porch. So I'll ask you to say whatever you came to say to her directly, because a conversation about Mrs. Calloway that doesn't include Mrs. Calloway isn't one I'm going to be part of." Warren looked at Ruth. He adjusted his smile the way he adjusted all his instruments precisely for the audience. "Ruth, you know I only want what's best for Thomas's children. Thomas's children are well fed and sleeping safely," Ruth said. "They're not going anywhere with you. I have a court order." "You have a document from a judge you own," Ruth said. "And you're standing on private property making claims about children who are in the care of their mother. If you'd like to pursue this through proper legal channels, I suggest you speak to Mr. Thomas Garrett of Denver." She held his gaze. "He's been retained." Something shifted in Warren's face. She'd expected the mask to hold. It held, but the thing behind it changed temperature. He hadn't expected Garrett's name. He hadn't expected any name at all, and certainly not a territorial lawyer with a reputation for taking land cases. "You've retained a lawyer," he said. "We have," Ruth said. The "we" landed in the yard between all of them. Warren looked at Elias. Elias looked back with the complete, unhurried steadiness of a man who has decided something and is done reconsidering it. This is a complicated situation, Warren said. He was recalculating. She could hear it in the careful pacing of his words. There are aspects of Thomas's estate that... The copper survey, Ruth said. Warren went very still. The assessment filed in December. The holding company registration. The adjacent parcel claims. She held his gaze with everything she had. I know about all of it, Warren. I've known since before Thomas died. The silence that followed was the loudest thing that had happened in Millhaven in some time. Warren's lawyer shifted in his saddle. Warren himself stood in the yard with the first genuinely unguarded expression Ruth had ever seen on his face. Not anger, not warmth, not calculation. Just the naked moment of a man who has been outflanked and knows it. That document is private business, he said quietly. Between family. Thomas was family, Ruth said. His children are family. You are a man who spent 3 years positioning himself to take advantage of a dying man's land. And I have a copy of the survey that proves it. Warren looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Elias. You have no idea what you've gotten yourself into, he said. It was quiet, controlled, and meant entirely for Elias. I have a fair idea, Elias said. I'd say the same to you. Warren put his hat back on. He mounted his horse with the dignity of a man who was not done and wanted you to know it. His lawyer was already turning his horse toward the road. This isn't finished, Ruth, he said. I know it isn't, she said. That's why I have a lawyer. He rode out. She watched him go, watched the dust settle behind his horse, and she stood on the porch and she shook. Not visibly, not in the way that anyone watching would have seen. Just internally, in the deep places, the shake of something that has been braced for impact and has to unclench now that the impact has passed. Elias walked to the porch. He stopped at the bottom of the steps and looked up at her. You all right? No, she said, because he'd asked for honesty and she was going to keep giving it. I'm not. But I will be. She looked at him. He's going to go to the land office. He's going to file something. He's going to find a way to use that guardianship document, even without Harker's jurisdiction, because he has money and time, and he is very patient. I know, Elias said. And Garrett is good, but we don't have... She stopped. Ruth. He said her name the way he said the things that mattered. Quiet, direct, no distance in it. I need to say something to you, and I need you to hear it before you tell me all the reasons it doesn't make sense. She looked at him. He looked back. And what was in his face was not the careful neutrality, not the controlled expression. It was the thing underneath. Open, unguarded, the way his face had looked the morning she'd watched him realize the children weren't going to be easy to keep at a distance, and that he was no longer trying. A married woman, he said carefully, can't have her children taken by a guardianship claim based on instability. A married woman with property and a husband who stands before a judge and speaks for her. He stopped. I'm not asking you for anything beyond that. I want to be clear about what I am and am not saying. The kitchen was 50 feet away and completely silent. The barn behind him was full of horses that didn't have opinions. The Colorado sky was enormous and absolutely indifferent. Ruth Calloway looked at Elias Grove and said nothing for a long moment, because the thing happening in her chest did not have a quick translation into words, and she'd learned enough to know that forcing a translation too fast always got it wrong. You've known us for 18 days, she said finally. I know. He didn't look away. I know enough. That's not an argument. No, he agreed. It's not. I'm not trying to argue. He looked at her steadily, with the quiet certainty of a man who has reached the bottom of a decision and found solid ground there. I'm trying to tell you that whatever is coming, you don't have to be standing alone when it arrives. Ruth pressed her hand flat against the porch railing. She looked at this man, this quiet, careful, decent man who carved horses from scrap pine and fixed door latches without announcement, and had just stood in his own yard and faced down Warren Pruitt without raising his voice once. "I'll think on it," she said. It was the most she could give him right then. He seemed to know it. "That's all I'm asking," he said. Behind the closed door of the back room, she could hear Sam's voice, low and steady, telling Nora something in the particular tone he used when he was trying to sound certain about something he wasn't certain about at all. And Nora's voice quieter answering. And the sound of two children who had been bracing for so long that they'd forgotten
This
what it
story
felt
was
like
posted
not
on the
to.
channel The Rusty
Ruth
Saddle.
straightened her
Please
spine.
do not
She went
repost it in any
inside.
form.
She thought on it for 2 days. She thought on it the way she thought on everything that mattered, not continuously, not with the obsessive circling that led nowhere but in the spaces between tasks. While she was kneading bread dough, while she was checking the water troughs, while she was lying on her side of the narrow mattress in the dark, listening to the sounds the house made when it was settling. She thought about what Elias had said and what he hadn't said. She thought about the difference between a practical arrangement and a promise, and whether a practical arrangement made by a decent man was worth more than a promise made by one who wasn't. She'd had a promise. She'd worn the ring for 6 years, and she knew exactly what a promise from a man who meant it when he said it, but couldn't sustain it, was worth when the winter came, and the money ran thin, and the illness moved in and took up residence like a tenant who stopped paying rent. Elias hadn't offered her a promise. He'd offered her a fact, a married woman with a property and a husband who stands before a judge. That was all. That was the whole of it, said plain without decoration, which was exactly how Elias Grove said everything that mattered. On the second evening, she went out to the porch and found him there, the way she sometimes found him, not restless, not performing solitude, just present in the dark with his coffee and the Colorado sky doing its enormous indifferent thing above them both. She sat in the other chair. She didn't speak immediately. He didn't fill the silence. After a while she said, "I have conditions." He looked at her. "We keep our arrangements clear between us," she said. "I work the household. I keep the books if you want it. I don't ask for more than room and board for myself and the children until we're on steadier ground." She looked at him. "And you tell me the truth, whatever it is, even when it's difficult, especially when it's difficult." "Those aren't conditions," Elias said. "Those are things I'd do regardless." "Then we understand each other." He looked at her for a long moment in the dark. "Ruth," he said, "I want to ask you something, and I need you to answer it straight." "All right." "Are you afraid of me?" The question surprised her enough that she answered it before she could construct a careful version of the answer. "No," she said. And then, because it was the truth, and he'd asked for that, "You're the first man I've been around in a long time who I'm not afraid of." That's its own kind of unsettling. Something moved in his face that was almost a smile, and was something more serious than a smile. "Yeah," he said. "I know what you mean." They sat in the dark for a while longer. The horses shifted in the barn. Sam had been asleep for 2 hours. Nora, who claimed she didn't need as much sleep as other people her age, had probably been reading by lamplight for at least one of those hours. "Yes," Ruth said. Elias looked at her. "My answer," she said, "to what you asked the other day. It's yes." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "All right, just that. No performance. No excessive reaction in either direction. Just the settling of a thing decided the way he settled everything." "All right," she said. They went inside. Nora found out the next morning, in the particular way Nora found out things she had already half known, filed the evidence, and was waiting for the confirmation so she could close the file and move on. Ruth told her at the kitchen table while Elias was outside and Sam was still asleep. "You're getting married," Nora said. It was not a question. "Yes." "To protect us from Warren Pruitt." "That's part of it." Nora looked at her with those gray eyes that had been taking accurate inventory of the world since she was 3 years old. "What's the other part?" Ruth considered her daughter, considered how much truth a 9-year-old who had already carried too much truth was equipped to hold. Then she considered that this was Nora, and Nora was always equipped for more truth than you thought she was. "He's a good man," Ruth said, "and good men are rarer than they should be. And when you find yourself in a situation where a good man is willing to stand beside you, it is not nothing." Nora processed this with the seriousness she applied to all important information. "Do you love him?" "I don't know him well enough yet." "But you could." Ruth looked at her daughter. "Yes," she said quietly. "I think I could." Nora nodded once, closing the file. "Sam's going to be dramatic about it," she said, and picked up her fork. Sam was not dramatic about it. Sam was something Ruth hadn't anticipated. He went completely quiet. For almost 20 minutes after she told him, which was the longest, Sam had been quiet since he'd learned to talk. He sat at the kitchen table with his wooden horse in both hands and said nothing at all. Then he looked up at Elias, who had come in from outside, and was standing near the door with the careful stillness of a man waiting to see which way a thing was going to land. "Are you going to be our papa?" Sam said. The kitchen went still. Ruth opened her mouth. "Sam," she said. "I'm asking him," Sam said. Not rude, just clear. Elias came to the table. He pulled out the chair across from Sam and sat down, which was the thing he did when he was taking something seriously. He reduced the distance. He came down to the level of whatever mattered. He looked at Sam directly. "I'm going to be your mother's husband," he said. "What that means for you and me, that's something we build. It doesn't happen all at once." Sam looked at him for a long moment. "My papa was sick for a long time," he said, "before he died. He couldn't." He stopped. His mouth closed around whatever he'd been about to say, the way it always closed around the territory he didn't go into. Then he looked at the wooden horse in his hands. "You made me copper," he said. "I did." "You didn't have to." "No," Elias said. "I didn't have to." Sam turned the horse over in his hands one more time. Then he looked up and said with the complete sincerity of a 6-year-old who has made a decision, "Okay." Elias looked at him. "Okay." "Yeah." Sam set the horse on the table between them. "Okay." Ruth pressed her hand over her mouth and turned back to the stove. They were married 4 days later in Deputy Cole Harmon's office, which was smaller than ideal but had the advantage of a justice of the peace who asked no unnecessary questions, and a witness in Cole who had known Elias for 6 years and looked at Ruth during the brief ceremony with an expression of cautious approval that she understood was the highest endorsement he was prepared to offer on short acquaintance. It took 9 minutes. Ruth wore the cleanest dress she owned. Elias wore his good hat. Nora stood beside Ruth, with her arms folded and her face in the expression of a board member attending an important but slightly tedious procedural meeting. Sam stood beside Elias, and at the moment the justice of the peace said man and wife, he reached up and put his hand into Elias's with the matter-of-fact certainty of a child who has decided something is his and is not asking permission. Elias looked down at that small hand in his. Something moved in his face that he didn't try to manage. Outside, Cole held the door, and Ruth walked through it into the Colorado morning as Ruth Grove, which was the strangest and most accurate thing she'd been called in a long time. 9 minutes, Nora said, appearing at her elbow. Marriages aren't about the ceremony, Ruth said. What are they about? Elias, coming through the door behind them, with Sam still attached to his hand, said, showing up every day. That's what it is. Nora looked up at him. Is that what you're going to do? That's what I'm going to do, he said. She studied him with her characteristic thoroughness. Then she said, all right, in a tone that indicated she would be monitoring this commitment closely, and he should be aware of that. Sam said, can we get something to eat? I'm hungry. You're always hungry, Nora said. It's a long ceremony. It was 9 minutes. That's long when you're hungry. Ruth made a sound that was more laugh than anything she'd let herself make in months, and Elias looked at her when she made it quickly, as if the sound had caught him off guard, and something in his expression opened in the way it did occasionally when he forgot to manage it. Thomas Garrett arrived from Denver 6 days after the wedding. He was a small man with ink-stained fingers and the quiet efficiency of someone who had spent 30 years turning complicated situations into manageable ones, and had stopped being surprised by how complicated situations could get. He sat at the kitchen table with his files and his reading glasses and went through everything. Every document, every date, the copy of the survey Ruth had carried from Laramie Cole Harmon's written account of Warren Pruitt's December inquiry. Dr. Margaret Voss's letter regarding Nora's documented
This
anxiety
story was
symptoms,
posted on the channel The
consistent with
Rusty
prolonged
Saddle.
household
Please do not
instability.
repost it in
Nora
any
had
form.
stationed herself in the hallway just outside the kitchen. Everyone knew. Nobody said anything about it. "The guardianship claim is weaker than he wants you to believe," Garrett said without looking up from his papers. "Wyoming and Colorado Territory have separate jurisdictions, and Pruitt knows it. He's been relying on you not knowing it." He turned a page. "The land scheme is different. This is where he has real leverage because the survey was filed legitimately, even if his intentions weren't." "Can he use it to take the children's inheritance?" Ruth asked. "Not directly. But if he establishes guardianship through any court, he controls their legal decisions until they reach majority. That includes decisions about property." Garrett looked up. "Which means if the Callaway Northeast parcel is ever developed, he's positioned to direct those proceeds." He set his glasses down. "He doesn't need to steal the land. He just needs to control the people who own it." "So we stop him from getting the guardianship," Elias said. "You've already made that significantly harder." Garrett looked between them both. A married woman with established residence in Colorado Territory and a property-owning husband who will testify to household stability that undermines his primary argument. But he'll pivot. "To what?" Ruth said. "He'll argue the marriage is a legal maneuver, that it was executed specifically to circumvent his claim." Garrett picked his glasses back up. "Which it was in part. So we need to establish that this is a legitimate household and not a paper arrangement." From the hallway, Nora's voice said clearly, "It isn't a paper arrangement." Everyone looked at the hallway. Garrett looked at Ruth. Ruth made the small gesture that meant, "Come in or don't." Nora came in. She sat in the fourth chair with the composure of someone who had been waiting for an invitation to something she'd already decided to attend. Garrett looked at this child. "And you are?" "Nora Callaway," she said. "Grove now, I suppose." She said it as if she were testing the sound of it. "What do you need to prove it's a real household?" Garrett studied her for a moment. "Evidence of daily life," he said carefully. "Documented residence. Witnesses to the family's stability." He paused. "The kind of thing neighbors and community members speak to." "Agnes Whitmore," Elias said. "She's already told me she'll say whatever needs saying," Cole confirmed from his chair against the wall. "Her words, not mine." "Cole," Garrett said, "your written account of Pruitt's December inquiry is valuable. It establishes that he was conducting research on this property before Mrs. Callaway, Mrs. Grove, ever arrived in Millhaven. That speaks to premeditation rather than legitimate family concern." "And Dr. Voss," Ruth said. "She's been treating Nora." Garrett nodded. "A physician's testimony about the children's well-being and their current stability carries significant weight." He made a note. "I'll need to speak with her." Nora said, "What about the survey document the copy mama has?" Garrett looked at her. "It demonstrates intent. Combined with the December inquiry, it builds a picture of a man who has been planning this for years." He paused. "But I want to be direct with you all. Pruitt has money and connections, and he is not going to walk away cleanly. He'll file something with the territorial court. There will be a hearing." "When?" Elias said. "Within the month. He's already been to the land office." Garrett closed his folder. "But here's what I need you to understand. You are in a significantly stronger position than you were 3 weeks ago. You have jurisdiction, you have residence, you have witnesses, you have documentation of his premeditation, and you have a marriage certificate." He looked at Ruth. What you also have, Mrs. Grove, is a story. And stories matter in a territorial courtroom. A widow who ran to protect her children from a man who had been systematically positioning himself to control their inheritance. That is not the story of an unstable woman. That is the story of an exceptionally capable one. Ruth sat very still. She wasn't accustomed to being described that way by anyone who wasn't trying to use the description for their own purposes. Nora beside her said quietly, "I know." Ruth looked at her daughter. "I know that's what you are, Mama," Nora said with the plain simplicity of a child stating something so obvious it barely needed saying. "I've always known." Ruth pressed her lips together and looked at the table. Elias across from her said nothing, but he was looking at her with that open, unguarded expression that he got when he forgot to manage it, and she felt it the way you feel sunlight when you've been inside too long, with a kind of startled gratitude that it was still there. The letter from Warren Pruitt came 3 days before the hearing. It was addressed to Ruth in his precise, controlled handwriting, and she read it standing at the kitchen table, the way she read difficult things on her feet, spine straight, so whatever it contained hit her while she was already upright. "Ruth," it said, "I want you to understand that I bear you no personal ill will. I understand you were in a difficult position after Thomas died. I understand that a woman alone with 2 children makes decisions she might not otherwise make. What I am asking the court to consider is simply what is best for Nora and Samuel. 2 children deserve the stability of an established family. The Pruitt name has resources and standing that a recently contracted marriage on a Colorado ranch cannot provide. I am prepared to drop the arson inquiry entirely if you are willing to come to a reasonable arrangement regarding the children's primary residence. I am a patient man, Ruth. I always have been. W.P." She read it twice. Then she folded it and put it in her apron pocket and went outside and found Elias at the paddock fence and handed it to him without a word. He read it. His jaw tightened in the specific way it did when he was containing something hot. He folded it back up. "Arson inquiry," he said. "I wondered when that was coming," Ruth said. He looked at her. "Is there something I need to know?" She met his eyes. She'd promised him this. All of it, no pieces held back. "The night before I left Laramie," she said, "I went to Warren's property. He had a filing cabinet in the barn office. The original copy of the guardianship document was in it, along with 3 other copies and the original land survey." She held his gaze steady. "I took the survey copy, and I set fire to the filing cabinet." The paddock was quiet. Copper the gray mare moved to the far fence. Elias stood very still. "You burned his records," he said. "I burned his evidence, yes." She didn't look away. "The barn caught. I didn't intend the barn, I intended the cabinet. But I didn't stop it once it started, because every minute it burned was a minute he wasn't filing paperwork." She stopped. "I told you I did what I had to do." "You told me that," he said. "You didn't tell me about the fire." "No," she said. "I didn't." He turned away from her. 3 steps toward the barn stopped. She'd watched him do this before, the processing, the containing, the arriving at fairness before he spoke. She waited. She'd learned that waiting for Elias Grove was always worth it. He turned back. His face was set, but his eyes were clear. "Garrett needs to know," he said. "I know. Today. I know Elias. Because if Pruitt is using it as leverage in this letter, he's planning to use it in that courtroom. And Garrett cannot be surprised by it." His voice was not angry. It was the voice of a man who had been given one more piece of incomplete information and was choosing to address it rather than be derailed by it. "How long have you known he was going to bring this up?" "Since Pueblo," she said. "Since Agnes told us he'd been asking questions. A man like Warren doesn't come into a territory empty-handed." "You should have told me then." "Yes," she said. "I should have." He looked at her for a long moment. She held his gaze and didn't offer excuses because she didn't have any that were better than the truth she'd been afraid. Not of him. Of what it might change. Of being the woman who had brought arson into his house on top of everything else. "Ruth," he said. "I know," she said. "I know I keep doing this. I know I hold things back, and then the right moment never comes, and the moment I finally say it is always worse than if I'd said it earlier." Her voice was even, but her hands were not. She pressed them flat against her thighs. "I am not good at being helped. I am working on it."
This story
He
was
looked at her
posted on
for
the
a long
channel The
moment.
Rusty Saddle.
Then he
Please do
said
not
with the
repost
quiet
it in any
certainty
form.
that was the most Elias thing about him. "You are the most capable person I have met in a long time. And capable people have the hardest time asking for help because they've spent years proving they don't need it." She stared at him. "That's..." She stopped. "Accurate," he said. She pressed her lips together. "Yes." "Then let me help. Not because you can't manage it. Because you don't have to." She stood at the paddock fence in the Colorado afternoon and felt something in her chest move that she hadn't let move in a very long time. Not the lurch of fear. Not the particular tension of waiting for something to go wrong. Something quieter and more dangerous than either of those things. The beginning of something she didn't have a careful name for yet. "We should go talk to Garrett," she said. "We should?" He agreed. They walked to the house together. Sam was on the porch with Copper, the wooden horse, making him leap from post to post and providing sound effects. He looked up when they came toward the steps. "Is everything okay?" he said, with the immediate alertness of a child who had learned to read adult faces before he learned to read words. "Yes," Elias said. "We have some business to take care of." "About Warren Pruitt?" "Yes." Sam looked at him. Then he held out Copper. "Take him," he said. "For luck." Elias looked at the small wooden horse in Sam's outstretched hand. He took it, the way he took everything Sam offered him, carefully with both hands, as if what was being offered was worth being received that way. He put it in his shirt pocket. Sam watched it disappear into the pocket with a look of complete satisfaction. "He's good luck," Sam said. "I know because Mama said you're good luck and you made him so." He applied the logic of someone for whom this conclusion was self-evident. It works both ways. Ruth looked at her son. She looked at Elias. She thought about 9 minutes in Cole Harmon's office and a small hand reaching up for a larger one. She thought about a wooden horse carried from Laramie to Mill Haven in a carpet bag that also held $3.42 and a copied land survey and the accumulated weight of every decision she'd made under fear and every one she'd made in spite of it. She thought about a hearing in 3 days with a territorial judge she hadn't met, and a lawyer from Denver she was beginning to trust, and a man standing on her porch with a wooden horse in his pocket because a 6-year-old had decided it was necessary. "Let's go," she said. They went inside. Garrett spent 2 hours with Ruth the evening before the hearing, going through everything one final time. He sat across from her at the kitchen table with his notes spread between them, and his reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, and he asked her the questions Warren Pruitt's lawyer was going to ask, and he asked them without softening them because a soft rehearsal made for a soft witness, and a soft witness made for a lost case. "You left Laramie in the middle of the night," he said. "How does that not look like flight?" "It looks exactly like flight," Ruth said. "Because it was. I was fleeing a man who had positioned himself to take my children through a court system he had spent years compromising. You had no legal representation at the time. I had $3.42. Legal representation requires money I did not have. You burned Warren Pruitt's property. I destroyed documents that were being used as instruments of fraud against my children's inheritance. The fire spread beyond my intention. That's not a legal defense." "No," Ruth said. "It's the truth. I'll let you make it a legal defense." Garrett looked at her over his papers. "You're going to be fine," he said. It was the first non-procedural thing he'd said all evening. She looked at him. "Is that a legal opinion?" "It's a professional one." He took his glasses off entirely. "I've been doing this for 30 years, Mrs. Grove. I know the difference between a woman who ran because she was guilty and a woman who ran because she had no other option. So does Judge Aldrich." He paused. "Warren Pruitt is going to walk into that courtroom tomorrow with money and connections and a story he's polished for months. You're going to walk in with the truth. In my experience, the truth is harder to use, but it holds up longer under pressure." Elias, who had been at the desk throughout this exchange saying nothing, said, "What about the arson complaint specifically?" "He can file it," Garrett said. "He has filed it. But in order for it to have any teeth in a Colorado territorial court, he needs to demonstrate that Mrs. Grove acted with criminal intent rather than necessity. Given what we can document about the contents of that filing cabinet, the fraudulent guardianship claim, the land survey scheme, the evidence of judicial corruption in Laramie County, necessity becomes a very compelling argument." He looked at Ruth. "You destroyed fraudulent documents being used against you. That is the story we are telling." "Is it the true story?" Nora said from the hallway. Everyone looked at the hallway. Nora was in her nightgown with her arms crossed and her gray eyes entirely alert. She'd been put to bed an hour ago, which had apparently been a formality. "Nora," Ruth said. "I want to know if it's true," Nora said. "Not just the legal version, the true version." Garrett looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at Ruth. Ruth gave him the small nod that meant answer her straight. "Yes," Garrett said. "It is both." Nora looked at him for one more assessing second. Then she looked at her mother. "Good," she said. And she went back to bed. Sam was asleep, and had been asleep since 8 o'clock, which was one mercy. He'd spent the afternoon making Copper the wooden horse leap from Elias's knee to the kitchen table, and back conducting a running commentary on the horse's various adventures that had required no audience participation, but had filled the house with the particular noise of a child who was working very hard at being fine. Ruth had let him talk. It was what he needed. Nora withdrew and went quiet when she was afraid. Sam talked louder. She'd learned not to try to change either of them. After Garrett left and the children were settled, Ruth stood at the kitchen window and looked at nothing in particular, which was the closest she got to not thinking. Elias came and stood beside her, not close enough to crowd, just present the way he was present solidly, without requiring anything in return. "Tell me something that has nothing to do with Warren Pruitt, or the hearing," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "When I first bought Copper Ridge, the northeast pasture was overrun with sage. I spent an entire summer clearing it by hand, just me and the ground and the sun, and by August I'd gotten maybe half of it done, and I sat down in the middle of the cleared section one evening, and I thought, this is the first thing I've done in 2 years that I can see the result of." Ruth listened. "After the war," he said, "after Margaret, the things I knew how to do stopped making sense. Medicine didn't make sense, but land did. Land is honest. You put work into it, it shows you the work." He paused. "That northeast pasture is the best grazing ground on the property now." Ruth looked at him. "You miss it," she said. "Medicine." He was quiet for a long moment. "Sometimes," he said. "Less than I used to." She thought about Nora asking him questions about wound care with those methodical gray eyes. She thought about Elias answering them with the patience of a man who'd found something he thought was gone. She thought about the way he'd looked at Sam's cut hand before Sam had said a word about it. "It didn't leave you," she said. "You just put it somewhere you thought you couldn't reach it." He looked at her, the open expression, the unmanaged one. "Yeah," he said. "I reckon so." They stood at the window in the dark for a while longer, and Ruth thought that this exact ordinary thing, standing beside someone in a kitchen after a hard day with harder ones still coming, was something she had not had in so long that she'd stopped expecting it. And yet, here it was. Here he was. Solid and honest and present in a way that required nothing theatrical from either of them. She slept better than she had since Laramie. She didn't examine why. The Colorado Territorial Courthouse in Millhaven was a two-story building that smelled like old paper and institutional authority, which Ruth supposed was the point. She walked in with Elias at her side, and Garrett slightly ahead, and Cole Harmon behind them, and she kept her chin level, and her hands still, and she did not look around the room for Warren Pruitt, until she had established herself in the space first. He was already seated at the opposing table. His Denver lawyer, not the local one he'd brought to Copper Ridge. A more expensive version sat beside him with a case file that was thicker than Garrett's, which was the kind of detail that was meant to be noticed. Warren himself looked exactly as he always looked, composed, warm. The kind of man who made rooms feel comfortable and then used that comfort against you. He looked at Ruth when she came in. He smiled. She looked away first, not because the look unsettled her, but because she had nothing to say to his smile and no intention of performing a response to it. Judge Aldrich was a small, dry, precise man who had been on this bench for 22 years and had the economy of movement of someone who had long since stopped doing anything for effect. He looked at both parties over
This
his
story was
spectacles with
posted
the
on the
expression
channel
of
The
a man
Rusty
who has
Saddle.
heard every
Please do not
version of every
repost it in
story
any form.
and is primarily interested in which version holds up. He read the guardianship claim. He read the marriage certificate. He read Garrett's brief, which was 31 pages, and contained the survey copy, Cole's written account, Dr. Voss's letter regarding the children's current stability and documented improvement, and Agnes Whitmore's signed statement that could best be described as an enthusiastic character assassination of Warren Pruitt and everything he represented. Then he looked up. "Mr. Garrett," he said, "your clients are contesting the jurisdictional validity of the Laramie County order." "We are, Your Honor," Garrett said, "on the grounds that Colorado Territory courts are not bound by Wyoming Territory civil orders, and on the further grounds that the original guardianship claim was filed under circumstances that constitute fraud upon the court. The fraud allegation being based on what? The concurrent filing of a fraudulent land survey scheme by the same party, Your Honor, designed to use guardianship as a mechanism for controlling inheritance of mineral rights belonging to the Callaway children." Garrett set the survey copy on the table. "We have documentation." Warren's lawyer was on his feet. "Your Honor, this is a guardianship proceeding, not a land dispute." "Sit down, Mr. Ellis," Aldrich said without particular force, but with the absolute certainty of a man who controls the room. Ellis sat. Aldrich looked at the survey copy. He looked at it for a long time. Then he looked at Warren Pruitt. "Mr. Pruitt," he said, "this survey was filed in December of last year." "Yes, Your Honor." Warren's voice was steady, measured. He was good. Ruth acknowledged that. He was very good. "That survey represents legitimate business interests that have no bearing on my concern for my late cousin's children." "Your late cousin's children, who stand to inherit the mineral rights on the northeast parcel of the Callaway property in Laramie County," Aldrich said. "The same parcel your holding company filed an adjacent claim on." "A coincidence of geography, Your Honor." Aldrich looked at him over his spectacles for a long moment. "Mr. Pruitt," he said, "I have been sitting on this bench for 22 years. I know what a coincidence of geography looks like, and I know what a plan looks like, and I'd like you to be very careful about the next thing you say to me." Warren's lawyer leaned toward him and whispered. Warren's face did not change. "Your Honor," he said, "the guardianship claim stands on its own merits regardless of any business considerations. My cousin's children need stability." "Mrs. Grove," Aldrich said, looking at Ruth, "please stand." Ruth stood. Elias beside her put his hand on the table near hers, not touching, just near. "Is it your testimony," Aldrich said, "that you left Laramie County voluntarily and of your own free will, with the intention of establishing stable residence for yourself and your children?" "Yes, Your Honor." "And that the circumstances of your departure were motivated by concern for your children's safety and legal standing?" "Yes, Your Honor. Warren Pruitt had filed a guardianship claim before I had legal representation or understanding of what was happening. He did this within 3 weeks of my husband's death before I had grieved, before I had any resources to contest it. She held her voice level. I left because staying meant accepting a situation that was not designed for my children's benefit. It was designed for his. The arson allegation, Aldrich said. Garrett rose. Your Honor, the fire at the Pruitt property destroyed documents that we can demonstrate were instruments of fraud, Mrs. Grove acted under conditions of extreme duress, with no legal recourse available to her, to protect evidence that would otherwise have been used against her children's interests. We are prepared to present full documentation of the fraudulent nature of those documents. Warren's lawyer was on his feet again. Your Honor, a crime is a crime regardless of. The documents you're referring to, Aldrich said to Garrett, cutting across Ellis without acknowledgement, include the original guardianship order and the land survey. And 3 supporting affidavits from individuals we can demonstrate had financial relationships with Mr. Pruitt at the time of signing Your Honor. The room went quiet in the particular way rooms went quiet when something important had just shifted. Aldrich looked at Warren. Warren's face was neutral. The mask was perfect. But his hands, Ruth noticed, had moved from the table to his lap. Just that. Just the hands. She'd learned to watch hands. Mr. Ellis, Aldrich said, does your client wish to make a statement regarding the land survey and its relationship to these proceedings? Ellis leaned to Warren. A longer whisper this time. Warren responded something low that Ruth couldn't hear. Ellis straightened. Your Honor, my client maintains that the survey and the guardianship proceeding are separate matters and requests that the court confine its consideration. I'll decide what this court confines its consideration to, Aldrich said. He looked down at the papers in front of him for a long moment. The room waited. Ruth breathed. Elias's hand was still near hers on the table, not touching, and she moved hers an inch until their fingers were side by side and felt the warmth of it and held still. Aldrich looked up. Mrs. Grove is a resident of Colorado Territory, he said. She is married to a property-owning citizen of Colorado Territory. Her children are in the custody of 2 parents in a stable home with documented community standing. He looked at Warren. The Laramie County order has no jurisdiction in my courtroom. The guardianship claim is dismissed. He turned to the next page in front of him. Regarding the arson allegation, given the documented fraudulent nature of the materials destroyed and the circumstances under which Mrs. Grove acted, I am declining to recognize the complaint as a valid basis for further proceeding in this territory. He closed the folder. Mr. Pruitt, I would strongly advise you to return to Laramie County. And I would further advise that any future approach to Mrs. Grove, her husband, or her children be made through legitimate legal channels with counsel who has actual standing in this jurisdiction. He looked at him over his spectacles one final time. We are done here. Ruth's knees did not go. She had locked them before she stood, and she kept them locked because she was Ruth Calloway Grove, and she did not fall in public places. But she felt the locking. She felt the full weight of 7 weeks of running release from the base of her spine all at once, like a rope under tension that had finally been cut, and the sudden lightness of it was almost more than the weight had been. Elias's hand closed over hers on the table. She let it. Warren stood. She watched him from across the room. The mask came back with the speed of long practice, and he looked at her across the distance between them, with the cold, flat expression that lived underneath all the warmth, the one she'd only seen twice before. And then he looked at Elias, and he made the calculation one final time, and he came up empty, and he walked out. Cole Harmon at the back of the room cleared his throat. Congratulations, he said, on approximately 6 different things simultaneously. Ruth almost laughed. She pressed her free hand over her mouth and breathed and thought about Nora in the hallway last night, asking if it was the true story, and Sam asleep with Copper, the wooden horse on the pillow beside him, and she thought, I am going home. Home. The word arrived in her chest like something she'd set down years ago, in a place she'd forgotten, and had just walked back to find it exactly where she'd left it. Warren Pruitt rode out of Millhaven before sundown. Cole confirmed it personally, watched him go from the door of the sheriff's office, and sent a rider out to Copper Ridge with the news. The rider caught them halfway back on the road, and Elias read the note and handed it to Ruth without a word. And she read it and folded it and put it in her pocket, and they rode the rest of the way in the kind of silence that wasn't empty. Nora and Sam were on the porch when the wagon came up the road. Nora was sitting on the step with a book she wasn't reading, her eyes on the road. Sam was standing on the top step with Copper the wooden horse in one hand and the focused expression of a child who had been waiting for a very long time and was done pretending he wasn't. He saw them come through the gate. He saw Ruth's face. He launched himself off the porch step with the total physical commitment of a 6-year-old who has decided that distance is an obstacle to be eliminated, and ran across the yard and hit Elias at about knee height, which was as high as he could reach at a run. Elias caught him. He picked him up in one motion, the way he'd gotten good at in the past 3 weeks, and Sam wrapped both arms around his neck and said into his shoulder, "Did you win?" "Yes," Elias said. "I knew it." Sam pulled back to look at him. "I told Nora. I said you'd win." "What did Nora say?" "She said she didn't have enough information to make a determination." Sam said this with the tone of someone reporting an unfortunate but characteristic occurrence. "But I knew." Nora had come off the porch with considerably more dignity and was standing at Ruth's shoulder looking up at her with those gray eyes that had been taking inventory of everything since before she could read. "It's done," she said. "It's done," Ruth said. "Pruitt?" "Gone." Nora was quiet for a moment. Something moved in her face. Not drama, not relief performed for an audience. Just the real thing. The private thing. The slow release of something a 9-year-old had been holding in her chest for 7 weeks on the road, and 3 weeks on a Colorado ranch waiting to find out if the ground was going to hold. She stepped forward and put her arms around Ruth's waist, and pressed her face against her mother's shoulder and held on. Ruth held her. She didn't say anything. There was nothing to say that the holding didn't already say better. Agnes Whitmore appeared the following afternoon with a covered dish and the expression of a woman who has been involved in something important and intends to remain peripherally present in its aftermath. She set the dish on the kitchen table and looked at Ruth with the careful softening that had been building in her face since the morning she'd driven out to warn them. "Chicken and dumplings," Agnes said. "You look like you haven't eaten properly in 2 months." "I haven't," Ruth said. "Then sit down." Agnes pulled out a chair with the authority of a woman in her own kitchen, even when she wasn't. "Both of you sit. Lord knows you've been standing long enough." They sat. Agnes served. Sam ate with the enthusiasm of someone who had decided that today was a day when the normal rules about how many dumplings one person could reasonably consume did not apply. Nora ate with quiet focus. Elias ate the way he always ate, steadily, without comment, with the particular attention of someone who had learned not to take a meal for granted. Agnes looked around the table. She looked at Sam, talking with his mouth almost full about the various qualities of Copper, the wooden horse, and its recent role as a good luck object. She looked at Nora, who was watching Sam with the fond exasperation of a sister who has decided that her brother is impossible and she wouldn't have it any other way. She looked at Elias, who was listening to Sam with the expression he wore when Sam was being particularly. Sam, the not-quite smile, the softness underneath the steadiness. She looked at Ruth last. "Well," Agnes said, "I believe this is what it's supposed to look like." Ruth looked around the table. She looked at all of it. Her daughter with her book beside her plate, her son with his wooden horse propped against his water cup, the man across the table who had carved that horse from scrap pine because a child he barely knew looked like he could use something to hold on to. She looked at the 4 chairs, the nail on the wall that now held a frame, the window that faced east. "Yes," Ruth said, "I believe it is." That evening, after Agnes had gone and the children were in bed, Sam asleep within minutes with Copper tucked under his chin, Nora reading for exactly as long as she thought she could get away with, before Ruth came to check. Ruth and Elias sat on the porch in the dark, The way they'd begun sitting on the porch in the dark, which was without announcement or ceremony, simply because it was where they both ended up at the end of the day. The Colorado sky was enormous. It was always enormous. She'd started finding it comforting rather than overwhelming, which she understood was a kind of progress. "Elias," she said. The northeast pasture." She looked at him. "The copper vein on Thomas's land. The children's inheritance." She paused. "It's going to need to be sorted out. Legally. The estate, the claims, all of it." "Garrett's already on it," Elias said. "He's filing in Laramie County next week. Without Pruitt's judge backing his play, the original estate documents stand. The property goes to the children." He paused. "With their mother as administrator until they come of age." Ruth looked at him. "You talked to Garrett about this?" "Yesterday, while you were talking to Agnes." He looked at her steadily. "You're their mother. The land is theirs. Those two things don't require Warren Pruitt in the middle of them." She sat with that for a moment. The land, Thomas's land, the northeast corner with the copper vein he'd known about, and never had the money to work. She thought about what it meant, not the money, not the practical weight of it, but the thing underneath that. That her children would have something that was theirs. Something that couldn't be taken by a man with a judge in his pocket, and patience, and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Something that would be there when they were grown, when they were making their own decisions, when they didn't need her to stand between them and the Warren Pruitts of the world. She thought about what she'd burned to get here. What she'd carried. What she'd said and not said and finally said, and what it had cost and what it had built. "I want to tell you something," she said. Elias waited. He was good at waiting. "When I left Laramie, I had a name on a piece of paper and 2 children and the particular kind of desperation that makes a person capable of things they wouldn't otherwise consider." She looked at him. "I did not expect to find this. I was not looking for this. I was looking for enough ground to stand on and enough time to figure out the next thing." "And," he said, "and I found considerably more than that." She held his gaze. "I found a man who fixed the door latch and carved a horse and stood in his own yard and told Warren Pruitt to say whatever he came to say directly. I found a man who asked for the truth and received it imperfectly and chose to stay anyway." She stopped. "I don't have a careful word for what that is to me." Elias looked at her across the small space between their chairs on a Colorado porch in the dark. He looked at her the way he looked at things that mattered all the way without deflection. "You don't need a careful word for it," he said. "You just need to let it be what it is." She thought about that. About all the things she'd carefully managed and carefully held back and carefully constructed into something presentable. About the cost of careful. About what it felt like to sit on a porch with someone who had seen the uncared version and had not moved an inch. She reached across the space between the chairs and put her hand over his. His hand turned over and held hers the way it had in the courtroom, completely and without reservation, like something that had always been meant to fit. They sat like that until the coffee was cold and the crickets were the only sound in Millhaven, Colorado, and the stars were doing their enormous indifferent thing above a ranch where 2 children slept without bracing for the morning, and a man who had spent 3 years learning to carry his losses had set them down long enough to pick up something else. Ruth Calloway had arrived at Copper Ridge with $3.42, 2 children, 1 copied land survey, and a secret she'd been carrying since Laramie. She had built something from those materials that no document could take, and no judge could dismiss, and no patient smiling man could price. She had built it the only way anything real ever gets built, one decision at a time in the wrong moments, without certainty, with everything she had. And it was enough. It was more than enough. It was hers. Ruth's knees did not go. She had locked them before she stood, and she kept them locked because she was Ruth Calloway Grove, and she did not fall in public places. But she felt the locking. She felt the full weight of 7 weeks of running release from the base of her spine all at once, like a rope under tension that had finally been cut, and the sudden lightness of it was almost more than the weight had been. Elias's hand closed over hers on the table. She let it. Warren stood. She watched him from across the room. The mask came back with the speed of long practice, and he looked at her across the distance between them with the cold, flat expression that lived underneath all the warmth, the one she'd only seen twice before. And then he looked at Elias, and he made the calculation one final time, and he came up empty, and he walked out. Cole Harmon at the back of the room cleared his throat. "Congratulations," he said, on approximately 6 different things simultaneously. Ruth almost laughed. She pressed her free hand over her mouth and breathed and thought about Nora in the hallway last night, asking if it was the true story, and Sam asleep with Copper, the wooden horse, on the pillow beside him, and she thought, I am going home. Home. The word arrived in her chest like something she'd set down years ago, in a place she'd forgotten, and had just walked back to find it exactly where she'd left it. Warren Pruitt rode out of Millhaven before sundown. Cole confirmed it personally, watched him go from the door of the sheriff's office, and sent a rider out to Copper Ridge with the news. The rider caught them halfway back on the road, and Elias read the note and handed it to Ruth without a word, and she read it and folded it and put it in her pocket, and they rode the rest of the way in the kind of silence that wasn't empty. Nora and Sam were on the porch when the wagon came up the road. Nora was sitting on the step with a book she wasn't reading, her eyes on the road. Sam was standing on the top step with Copper the wooden horse in one hand and the focused expression of a child who had been waiting for a very long time and was done pretending he wasn't. He saw them come through the gate. He saw Ruth's face. He launched himself off the porch step with the total physical commitment of a 6-year-old who has decided that distance is an obstacle to be eliminated, and ran across the yard and hit Elias at about knee height, which was as high as he could reach at a run. Elias caught him. He picked him up in one motion, the way he'd gotten good at in the past 3 weeks, and Sam wrapped both arms around his neck and said into his shoulder, "Did you win?" "Yes," Elias said. "I knew it." Sam pulled back to look at him. "I told Nora. I said you'd win." "What did Nora say?" "She said she didn't have enough information to make a determination." Sam said this with the tone of someone reporting an unfortunate but characteristic occurrence. "But I knew." Nora had come off the porch with considerably more dignity and was standing at Ruth's shoulder, looking up at her with those gray eyes that had been taking inventory of everything since before she could read. "It's done," she said. "It's done," Ruth said. "Pruitt. Gone." Nora was quiet for a moment. Something moved in her face. Not drama, not relief performed for an audience. Just the real thing, the private thing. The slow release of something a 9-year-old had been holding in her chest for 7 weeks on the road, and 3 weeks on a Colorado ranch waiting to find out if the ground was going to hold. She stepped forward and put her arms around Ruth's waist and pressed her face against her mother's shoulder and held on. Ruth held her. She didn't say anything. There was nothing to say that the holding didn't already say better. Agnes Whitmore appeared the following afternoon with a covered dish and the expression of a woman who has been involved in something important and intends to remain peripherally present in its aftermath. She set the dish on the kitchen table and looked at Ruth with the careful softening that had been building in her face since the morning she'd driven out to warn them. "Chicken and dumplings," Agnes said. "You look like you haven't eaten properly in 2 months." "I haven't," Ruth said. "Then sit down." Agnes pulled out a chair with the authority of a woman in her own kitchen, even when she wasn't. "Both of you sit. Lord knows you've been standing long enough." They sat. Agnes served. Sam ate with the enthusiasm of someone who had decided that today was a day when the normal rules about how many dumplings one person could reasonably consume did not apply. Nora ate with quiet focus. Elias ate the way he always ate, steadily without comment, with the particular attention of someone who had learned not to take a meal for granted. Agnes looked around the table. She looked at Sam, talking with his mouth almost full about the various qualities of Copper the wooden horse and its recent role as a good luck object. She looked at Nora, who was watching Sam with the fond exasperation of a sister who has decided that her brother is impossible, and she wouldn't have it any other way. She looked at Elias, who was listening to Sam, with the expression he wore when Sam was being particularly Sam, the not-quite smile. The softness underneath the steadiness. She looked at Ruth last. "Well," Agnes said, "I believe this is what it's supposed to look like." Ruth looked around the table. She looked at all of it. Her daughter with her book beside her plate, her son with his wooden horse propped against his water cup, the man across the table who had carved that horse from scrap pine because a child he barely knew looked like he could use something to hold on to. She looked at the 4 chairs, the nail on the wall that now held a frame, the window that faced east. "Yes," Ruth said. "I believe it is." That evening, after Agnes had gone and the children were in bed, Sam asleep within minutes, with Copper tucked under his chin, Nora reading for exactly as long as she thought she could get away with before Ruth came to check. Ruth and Elias sat on the porch in the dark the way they'd begun sitting on the porch in the dark, which was without announcement or ceremony, simply because it was where they both ended up at the end of the day. The Colorado sky was enormous. It was always enormous. She'd started finding it comforting rather than overwhelming, which she understood was a kind of progress. "Elias," she said. The northeast pasture." She looked at him. "The copper vein on Thomas's land. The children's inheritance." She paused. "It's going to need to be sorted out, legally. The estate, the claims, all of it." "Garrett's already on it," Elias said. "He's filing in Laramie County next week. Without Pruitt's judge backing his play, the original estate documents stand. The property goes to the children." He paused. "With their mother as administrator until they come of age." Ruth looked at him. "You talked to Garrett about this?" "Yesterday, while you were talking to Agnes." He looked at her steadily. "You're their mother. The land is theirs. Those 2 things don't require Warren Pruitt in the middle of them." She sat with that for a moment. The land. Thomas's land. The northeast corner with the copper vein he'd known about and never had the money to work. She thought about what it meant, not the money, not the practical weight of it, but the thing underneath that. That her children would have something that was theirs. Something that couldn't be taken by a man with a judge in his pocket, and patience, and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Something that would be there when they were grown, when they were making their own decisions, when they didn't need her to stand between them and the Warren Pruitts of the world. She thought about what she'd burned to get here, what she'd carried, what she'd said and not said, and finally said, and what it had cost and what it had built. "I want to tell you something," she said. Elias waited. He was good at waiting. "When I left Laramie, I had a name on a piece of paper and 2 children, and the particular kind of desperation that makes a person capable of things they wouldn't otherwise consider." She looked at him. "I did not expect to find this. I was not looking for this. I was looking for enough ground to stand on and enough time to figure out the next thing." "And," he said, "and I found considerably more than that." She held his gaze. "I found a man who fixed the door latch and carved a horse and stood in his own yard and told Warren Pruitt to say whatever he came to say directly. I found a man who asked for the truth and received it imperfectly and chose to stay anyway." She stopped. "I don't have a careful word for what that is to me." Elias looked at her across the small space between their chairs on a Colorado porch in the dark. He looked at her the way he looked at things that mattered all the way without deflection. "You don't need a careful word for it," he said. "You just need to let it be what it is." She thought about that, about all the things she'd carefully managed and carefully held back and carefully constructed into something presentable, about the cost of careful, about what it felt like to sit on a porch with someone who had seen the uncared version and had not moved an inch. She reached across the space between the chairs and put her hand over his. His hand turned over and held hers the way it had in the courtroom, completely and without reservation, like something that had always been meant to fit. They sat like that until the coffee was cold, and the crickets were the only sound in Millhaven, Colorado, and the stars were doing their enormous indifferent thing above a ranch where 2 children slept without bracing for the morning, and a man who had spent 3 years learning to carry his losses had set them down long enough to pick up something else. Ruth Calloway had arrived at Copper Ridge with $3.42. 2 children, 1 copied land survey, and a secret she'd been carrying since Laramie. She had built something from those materials that no document could take, and no judge could dismiss, and no patient smiling man could price. She had built it the only way anything real ever gets built, one decision at a time, in the wrong moments, without certainty, with everything she had. And it was enough. It was more than enough. It was hers.